Hello, welcome back. This is the last round of the Ohio Chess Congress, my game analysis of it, and I had the black pieces. I had 3 out of 4 going into the last round, and yeah, I was black against my friend Gajanan, who is from India, so his rating was provisional, but he goes to, or he lives in Cincinnati now, so. I know him from that, and I've played him a bunch, but this was my first time playing him in classical chess. And it was a really crazy fight. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy the crazy game. So here we got another Benko. So I was pretty happy to get this, especially because I felt like if I wanted to get anything out of the tournament, if I wanted to get in the money, if I wanted to have a chance to become the Ohio Chess Champion, I had to play for a win, and I feel like the Benko is a great opening to play for the win. So my opponent took. And if you want a more detailed explanation of this opening, we have a lot of videos on it. And my first round, I kind of went a little bit deeper into the opening. But my opponent plays G3 here, which is kind of a new, or I guess a different idea than what most people typically see. Most of the time, white tries to grab space in the center with e4, but this is kind of a more conservative approach, and it could cause some problems for black if black's not careful. So after g3 here, I played castles, bishop g2, and now I don't want this bishop to open up and a move like d6 to happen, so I play d6 myself. And then white plays knight to f3. I bring my knight out. Again, similar to the last Benko you saw, I just was very patient. I didn't want to take this pawn too early because it's a sitting duck. There's no reason that there's no way that white's going to be able to protect that pawn because I just have too much firepower against it. So there's no rush. I can take it whenever I feel like it, and yeah, so I just wait for the right moment to do so. Typically, the right moment is after I develop this knight, then I feel like this is my next piece to develop. So that's when I would take on a6 or something of the sort. So anyway, my opponent plays h3, and h3 was a surprise. I knew h3 wasn't really a common move or really anything I had to worry about because h3 is kind of geared towards stopping one of my pieces from getting to the g4 square. And I knew that wasn't really an idea in this position. I knew this bishop either goes to a6 or it goes to f5. It never really goes to g4. Sometimes this knight goes to g4, but if I move this knight, say to b6, well, now this knight, usually the idea of going to g4 is to reroute back to e5, and I can do the same idea by going to d7 and to e5. So I wasn't really scared of this move. If anything, it just gives me more time. So now I play knight to b6. Um, I actually I didn't really know how to play this opening. The one thing I remembered is to bring this knight to b6. Um, that was just kind of the idea I remembered. It's important to bring that knight to b6 because when the bishop's not on this diagonal, the knight coming to c4 is actually very strong. And we'll see that a little bit later. But anyway, after castles, bishop takes a6. Again, now that I've developed this knight, now it's time for me to develop this bishop. That's why I only take now. And then white plays a4. And I play knight f to d7. So this is kind of the idea I was talking about earlier. Um, it's similar to knight g4, where I'm going to bring this knight to e5 and trade it off for this f3 knight. The other idea I had is if I could play c4 and bring my knight to c5, that's also a really great square for the knights because it could hop into b3. So I was already quite happy with this position. And then I was even happier when my opponent played rook to e1 because I knew that this is not really the idea in the position. Here, white should try to play moves like knight d2 and queen c2. Usually this is the idea of the setup. You want to bring the knight to d2. Most lines you want it on c4, but I already have really good control of that square because my opponent wasted time with h3. But anyway, knight to d2 is kind of what you have to try to do if you're white here. But instead, rook to e1 was played. And the reason this isn't great is because white is trying to play e4, and as soon as he plays e4, he weakens this d3 square. So that's going to be a big kind of target in the position, and my pieces are just going to be very well placed for this, and it's never really, like e5 is never really an issue. He's blocking his own bishop. It's not really the best plan in the position for a number of reasons, but at the same time, it's hard to come up with anything else. Knight to d2 isn't very intuitive. It doesn't really do a lot in white's position, doesn't really improve it a lot. Anyway, I play knight to c4. Something I wanted to show, if queen to c2, I could still play knight c4, and then if b3 to try to like kick this out, there's this cool idea of just playing queen to a5. And you let them take here because you can take here, and then that c4 pawn is weak. So black has actually gained a pretty significant edge here, and it's a cool trick in the position. And that's why this knight to d7, to b6, to c4 is so strong, because you can't really kick it out. There's absolutely no way for white to kick it out in general, which is why it's so strong. So after in the game, rook to e1, I play knight c4, and my opponent plays e4. Again, that's kind of the wrong plan. And now I go queen to a5. So I'm putting a lot of pressure on the c3 knights and potentially threatening to undermine it and remove the defender and take on c3. So my opponent plays bishop to f1, and after bishop f1, I just kind of saw that he didn't deal with my threats, so I took on b2. That's a free pawn. I did gambit a pawn, so now the material is equal, but I do have a lot of play in return for that. I guess play in return for getting the pawn back. I don't know. I still have some initiative, is what I'm trying to say. My opponent takes the knights. Now I take on f1. And my opponent took with the king. I thought taking with the king was a little interesting. It makes sense to keep the rook here, but this king can become vulnerable, as we'll see a little bit later. And then here I took on c3. I didn't even consider this other move because I was so worried about getting my material back. But rook to b8 would have been quite strong because if a move like, say, queen to c2 to protect this, I could play rook takes b2, queen takes b2, then bishop takes c3. And at the end of the day, I think this pawn is very close to being won, or I just have a lot of pressure in the position. This pawn is very, very close to being won either way, and I'm going to be able to win back the material, so it's going to be equal. But since that a4 pawn is weak, that's why the eval is like -1-ish. Anyway, I didn't consider that. I definitely should have. I just took on c3, which is fine, but not the most critical move. So my opponent plays rook to e2. Another kind of weird move. I thought he kind of had to take on c3, but he didn't. So after this, I was pretty happy because now I can take the b file, and I had already won my material, putting pressure on the b2 bishop. So I was pretty happy to get to play that move. My opponent plays queen c1, and now after queen c1, again, I was pretty happy to see this move. I took on b2, and then here I made a mistake. I took on b2 again when I should have just played rook to b4. Rook to b4 puts a lot of pressure on this a4 pawn, and it's not so clear what he does. If he takes, he can play like queen c2 to try to hold on to this guy, but then I play c4, the knight comes to c5, and from c5 it attacks a4. I really just underestimated how much play I had in this position. I just thought it would be pretty equal, but the engine definitely proves otherwise. Um, so I wanted to just have complete control of the B file, which is why I traded. and then I brought my rook to b4. But this isn't quite as good um, because my opponent plays king g2 here, and the reason king g2 is so strong is because I just walked into a pin. He just pinned my rook, so I can't take on a4 or on e4 because of that pin. So for example, if rook takes a4, he has queen takes a5, rook takes, and then rook takes, and white is up a rook. So I um, kind of walk into this pin in a pretty annoying manner. And after this, I kind of start to mess up a little bit. I played f6. In positions like back here, I maybe like close to here, I started to calculate a lot of lines where my opponent played e5, and I really hated seeing that e5 move. And I kind of took that analysis and um, used it to justify me playing f6 here, but e5 really isn't anything scary because as soon as they play e5, well, first off, I could take it right now, but this d pawn becomes very weak. So it's really nothing to worry about. I just kind of got in my head, saw some ghosts. So I need to make sure that I'm seeing real threats if I'm playing defensively. But yeah, f6, not super accurate. My opponent plays h4, strong move, trying to cause up problems on my king side. If he can play h5 and open things up, then my king can get into some trouble, especially if the rook can swing over to the h file. So I play queen to a8. I was very happy with this move. Computer is not as happy, but my idea was I'm attacking a4 now since this rook isn't pinned, and I'm also attacking e4. So I thought, okay, he has to do something about that. Queen c2 looks like the only way to do that, and then I have f5. And after f5, his whole structure falls apart. If he takes, I have queen takes, and this pressure on this diagonal is really strong, so he can't keep taking because I have rook b3. So I was really happy with all this calculation, and but instead of queen a8, it's just best to do something simple like h5. Just play it slow. Um, but I got a little overzealous, and the position's still not terrible. But if my opponent plays a5 here, I can get into some trouble because this a pawn starts to become very strong and very hard to deal with. But anyway, my opponent plays queen c2, so I kind of get away with it. And then I play f5. And again, I was really happy to play this move because I saw this trick where my opponent takes, I take, and then if they take on g6, I have rook to b3, and I am going to win the knight. Uh, if they play queen e2, I have knight to e5, and there's just no way to defend that knight. So very, very strong move, rook to b3, and I was very happy to see this. But unfortunately, my opponent plays rook to a3 and just shuts that down right away. So again, anytime it felt like I had something, he just kind of defended it and prolonged the game. But I really felt like I was on the verge of winning here because of this pin. I could play knight to e5. I have a lot going on here. But here I took on f5, and my opponent plays a5. So now he's sacrificed two pawns for this passed a pawn. And this a pawn, again, is very strong. So I had to be careful. But these pawns are also pretty strong. So here I took a very, very big think. And I calculated this whole line. And when I saw this line, I let out a smile. I was really happy. This was the line I calculated. I calculated c4, a6, rook to b3, rook takes b3, c takes b3, queen c8 check, and I'm in trouble here if because he's forking my king and my knight. If I play knight to f8, he can just play a7, and his pawn is way faster than mine. So anyway, after queen c8, I saw this move king to f7, and then if they take on d7, I have b2. And it's just a really, really crazy line where my opponent can't go to b7 or to b5 to stop this pawn. If they go queen b7, I can take it, they take back, I queen, and I cover white's promotion square, and I'm winning. And I saw this whole line, and I was like, I was so happy that I saw this. I thought I just like won the game with this line. But I got a little overzealous. It's not that simple. So I play c4. C4 is still a fine move. A6, rook b3. This actually very close to happen in the game. After queen c8 check, I blitzed out king f7. I was again very happy to play this move. I felt like it was really strong. But here, instead of taking this knight, which just allows me to push my pawn um, to promotion, he just plays a7, and I was not as happy after seeing this move because I am in some serious trouble. This a7 pawn is one square away from queening, and that's a problem. So here, what I should have done is just to play b2, and then if my opponent queens, I would take, create my own queen. This endgame continues. I'm up a pawn, but with this knight coming to g5, probably a draw. Still pretty complicated though. I can still push for win. But that's what I should have done. Instead, I played knight to b6. I thought this was a way to kind of block this b file so I could push my pawn even further and control this a8 square. But knight to b6 obviously was not as strong according to the computer. If my opponent plays queen h8, I am in some real trouble because I totally missed this move. It covers the square that my pawn wants to go to, and it supports his own pawn. And it attacks h7. That queen is just a beast on that square, and it's a real issue for me. And white would be winning if this happened. Instead, my opponent played queen c3. And here I took a kind of big think again. I realized there isn't really a way for me to make clear progress. And I wasn't really sure what to do. And that's kind of how I played this move h6. And I feel like this move is a very important move. Is very strong because what this did was it stops this knight from coming to g5 in the future, and it stops this pawn from being taken with check in the future. So this was kind of a prophylactic move, um, which I think was very important. If I don't play this move, the eval jumps to like +2, +2.5. So again, I think this was a very important move to play h6 and just take a timeout. Now my opponent plays king to h2. They want to get out of this annoying pin, but what this does is, again, anytime your opponent moves a piece, think about what squares that piece was controlling. So this piece was protecting the knight on f3, and now it's not. So I try to deflect the queen from protecting it with knight to a4. Computer doesn't love this. It wants to see b2. It's just this crazy line. b2, queen takes b2, knight to c8. And the knight on c8 attacks the pawn. And white's best move is just a queen. Because if something like queen a3, I can play knight takes a7. Um, and then takes. So weird line. Um, but knight a4 is okay. But computer doesn't love it. Queen h8. Finally, he plays queen h8, which is a very strong move. And now I play the knight back to b6. I can't allow him to queen. I calculated a lot of lines where I push, and they never work out. So I retreat my knight. I have to cover this queening square on a8, and then he goes back to c3. So after going back to c3, I remember this phrase like always repeat once, especially because we were both getting kind of low in time. So I played knight to a4 again, and I repeated the same position once. If my opponent went back to h8, I think I would have tried to play for a win somehow. Not really sure how, but I would try to figure something out. But luckily, my opponent played queen takes b3, and I was very happy to see this move because after this, we kind of reach an endgame where I'm just up a pawn, and I feel like I'm definitely the only one who can play for a win at this point. And yeah, so I played knight to c5 here. Computer already says this is a bad move. It likes knight to b6, and then if the queen moves somewhere, queen d5. But I'm not exactly sure if this is good or not. Like if I should trust the computer here, because sometimes it misunderstands endgames, and I don't know. I feel like this endgame would be pretty close to drawish because my king is so open, but I could be wrong. So let me know in the comments what you think about this endgame. If black can play for a win here, but I didn't really think I had a ton of chances. Obviously, if I got this, I would have played for a win, but I didn't love my winning chances in this position. Um, so instead, I played knight to c5, and then I played queen to b7. So queen b7 was the best move, and I was really happy with this move again because I felt like trading would have helped me. I would be happy to go into a knight endgame where I can start to push these d and e pawns up the board. And if he doesn't go in the knight endgame, which is what happened in the game, I think he missed my idea, which was knight to d3. And now I'm ready to play knight e1 check and win his knight. So I thought I was completely winning after this move. My opponent gives me a few checks. I avoid like queen 6 f5 check, which would win a knight for him. So I had to be a little careful. But now I totally missed queen e6. I didn't see it at all. My opponent covers the e1 square, and I've got nothing. So just total miscalculation. And here, um, I spent a little bit of time thinking, and for some reason, I thought of this h5 move, and I couldn't figure out what to do after queen e3, like what was my next step. But I totally missed that knight e5 is just completely winning because if I can say he moves his queen, if I can trade all the pieces off the board. It's just a king and pawn in game. I'm just completely winning. I just play e5. I got this outside pass pawn. I'm up a very clean pawn. This should be very easily winning. And for some reason, I missed knight e5 and I missed this idea completely. So instead of h5, I ended up playing queen e4, which makes this a lot harder. And I think it should be a draw after this move, actually. So queen e4 is a huge mistake. I play h5, my opponent is very close to being in Zugzwang because they have to stay tied to e1 and they have to stay tied potentially to this knight. And the king can't move, the pawns can't move, the knight can't move, so it's really just this queen. So very, very bizarre position, but queen e4, fortunately, unfortunately, it was not a mistake. So, or was a mistake. Oh my gosh. I take back. His knight goes to d2, and now I protect it. My opponent tries to bring their king around. I play knight to c5. So I was worried about the king coming to e2, followed by f3. But it turns out I can just bring my knight to e5. Um, and then if the king ever walks up to e3, I have knight g4 check, and the king has to stay tied to this f2 pawn. So that's kind of what I missed. At this point, we both had a minute or less. We are very, very low on time. So this endgame was far from perfect. But I played d4. My idea, again, was to kind of block out the king. Knight c4 is played. I play knight a4. Yeah, you'll see the eval bar go up and down a ton. Again, very low on time. Far from perfect endgame, but I wanted to get my knight to c3. That was kind of my idea, because from c3, I could keep the king away from controlling the f3 square, so f3 wouldn't be possible. At this point, I knew the more pawns trade off, the closer it is to a draw, so I was just looking for ways that he could trade off pawns and looking for ways that I could avoid it. Knight e5 was played, king c7. I wanted to bring my king into the game. Also, my opponent was threatening knight to f7 check to win this pawn. So king c7, and then my opponent played h5, and I started to get a little scared because it looks like he's just going to win this pawn, and this h-pawn could actually give him some winning chances. But luckily, I have knight c3 check, and I can bring my knight all the way around. So if he does go knight to f7, I can go knight to f6, and we just trade pawns. So this would have been pretty close to a draw because, again, the more pawns trade off, the closer it is to a draw. But my opponent plays f3 here. I bring my knight back to f6, and then he plays g4. G4 was a weird move, but I can't really take on f3 because he takes with the knight, and then this pawn falls too. So it's a very weird position, but I played king d6, and my opponent plays knight f7 check. And here I made a huge miscalculation. If I play king to e6, again, we're both very low on time. If I play king to e6, knight takes, I can take here, and I totally miscalculated how strong this was. I thought, uh, maybe he could just go here, and I wasn't really sure how I make progress, but I could just bring my king in. And he can't make progress over here because he can't move his knight. His knight is tied down here, and he can't move his pawn because his pawn is tied down to this guy. So I could just march my king in, e5, f4, and I'm just winning. The other thing is, I was also worried about the knight coming to f5 because I felt like this pawn is hanging, and if I move up to protect it, then this pawn is hanging. But if this happens, now I can take, and I'm threatening to play f2, king e2, and then d3. Because if I can deflect the king from this promotion square, then I'm going to queen myself. So very crazy knight endgame. I totally miscalculated all this. And king e6 would have been winning. But instead, I played king d7, which you'll see the eval bar drop tremendously. Um, and the reason this is so bad is because, well, first off, my idea was after taking here, I would take here, and then after knight f5, I would play e5. And I would be able to protect this pawn. I'd have 3 connected pass pawns. I really like my chances there. His pawns are very close to falling, but problem is he doesn't have to take on h6. So he just takes on e4, which again was another mistake. And again, you'll see the eval bar shoot up. Very crazy endgame. But I played knight takes e4 check right away, which throws it again. If I take on g4, this is just winning because I'm protecting this h6 pawn. And if I can get e5, the game's over. My king can just walk in. And my position would just be very, very solid. And if my opponent plays e5, I can just play king e6. And I'm ready to potentially take on e5. So crazy knight endgame. And I managed to mess it up again. I check and take. And at this point, this is what I calculated. This is why I went into this. I saw I was pawn up. I knew this would be very close to a draw, but didn't really see how my opponent made progress. And I saw this idea, if I play this, my opponent has to bring this knight to h8, which I was very happy with. And I felt like this kind of gave me some chances. But again, I miscalculated. What I missed was if I play knight to f6, uh, I can't take this pawn on h5 because he just goes king g6. And uh, this is just enough to draw because, well, he's threatening my knight, threatening the pawn. And if he wins the pawn, for example, this pawn just isn't fast enough because the king just catches it. And I just can't win this. So I was devastated when I saw this, but I knew I had to keep playing on, keep playing for a win. So I played e6. I was really debating between knight f6 check and e6, and I'm very glad I played e6. Again, I didn't have a lot of time to think, but e6 essentially just keeps the pieces on the board. That's what really matters at this point. Just giving your opponent a chance to mess up and keeping the tension. So e6 keeps the pieces on the board and makes my opponent work for it. So my opponent plays knight g6. They try to get their knight out of there. I bring my king in, and I bring my king in again. And then he plays knight to h3. And so he's trying to stop my king from getting to g5. And this knight endgame is still very tricky. The computer suggests knight to d3, and then if my king goes up here, I can protect the pawn, but he just checks me. He doesn't go after the pawn, because if he goes after the pawn and plays like knight here, I can take, and he still can't take this pawn because we trade, and in the end, this pawn is going to queen. So very crazy. He can't take that pawn. He has to play knight to e6 check. And then once I take, he has to play king to f5. He's down 2 pawns, and he just leaves it that way. He just plays king f5, and there's no way I can make progress. After king h4, knight to g7. And again, there's no way to make progress. If h5, there's no way to make progress because you can't move the king. If king g3, it's king e4. And white is threatening knight f5 check, followed by knight takes h6. And once black takes back, king takes on e5, and it's just a draw. So it's crazy. This whole line is just very wild. Knight endgames are very crazy. But white's way to kind of hold this is to give up this pawn. Instead, my opponent tries to hold on to it, and I was very happy to see this because I play e5. And now this knight is shut out of the game. He's kind of in Zugzwang because he can't move this knight, otherwise my king gets to g5, and if he moves his king, which is what happened, I bring my king in. And after king g3, I knew I was winning. I played knight to f6, and that forces his king to h4, and now his king is just completely out of the game. I play e4, and again, he's kind of in Zugzwang because his king, his pawn both can't move, so he has to move his knight. And once his knight moves, now that allows my king to come into f4. I throw in this move as well, and now my king can go into e4, and this knight simply cannot hold against my king and pawn. Like, if it ever, it's just gonna have to sacrifice itself at some point, and that's gonna be enough for me to win. So he tries to bring his king in, but that allows me to take his pawn with check. So his king goes to f2. I protect my pawn, knight to f4. It's worth mentioning here, I could have also played king e3. I was looking at this, but I thought knight takes h5 kind of limited the risk in the position. So after knight to f4, now I just bring my king in. I bring my king all the way to d1, where it's supporting this queening square, and I'm ready to queen. And now I'm threatening potentially to um, actually, wait, no, I'm not threatening that just yet. So he goes here, and if I'm not careful, like for example, I don't know, if I queen, he would take and then take here, and he's gonna win this last pawn, and it would be a draw. So I had to be a little careful. I play knight to e6, and my idea of knight to e6 is after the king goes back, I have knight to g5, and my opponent resigned here because if the knight goes back to e1, I have knight to e4 check, and this king has no way of staying tied to the knight. So once it moves, I can take. Doesn't matter that he can take my knight because this pawn is going to queen, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. So he resigns, and I collapsed. I was like, oh my gosh, I was so tired. I put everything I had into this game. My previous game was extremely tiring as well. I was just so exhausted. And during the game, I was trying so hard just to think about the chess because I knew there's been so many tournaments in the past where going to the last round, if I won or if I did this result, I would have got like X amount of money. and that just gets in my head. I just can't think about that. I need to focus on the chess. Maybe think about the position and not about the results. So I tried so hard to do that. Another thing that helped me was I just would center myself. Like there were times where I could tell the position was ramping up and it was really stressful, really exciting and crazy, and I wasn't sure what was happening. And in those moments, I just did some deep breathing. I just took a few deep breaths and I kind of stopped my emotions from taking control of me. And I feel like that definitely helped in a lot of situations. So being able to recognize my emotions and control them was very helpful. And just being able to fight through, I had literally everything I had left in me was put into this game. It was a 75 move game. It was exhausting, and the last like 20 or 30 were all in time trouble. But after that game, I was one of the last in the whole tournament, and there was a whole crowd around me. And one of the tournament directors shook my hand after the game, was like, "Great game, and congratulations, you're the Ohio chess champion." And that just kind of like blew my mind because again, I tried so hard not to think about it. I didn't want to think about like if I win, I would do this. Um, and it was crazy. I was so tired that I don't feel like I totally understood what had happened, but I'm the Ohio chess champion, and that's really exciting. And I was very happy to win this game. Um, Props to Gajanan. He fought to the bitter ends. It was just a very crazy game and a really great fight. But yeah, I'm the Ohio chess champion, and uh, yeah, I just want to thank you guys for watching. Being along on this journey and watching these games and being a part of Chess Schools, it means a lot to me. And yeah, I just want to thank you guys for watching and hope to see you in future videos.